There's a specific feeling that arrives before most people can actually name what's happening, a quiet, growing unease that settles in long before any concrete evidence has surfaced, before any lie has been caught, before any pattern has become undeniable enough to point to directly. If you've ever experienced this, a sense that something is shifting, that clarity is somehow arriving even though nothing external has technically changed yet, you've likely wondered whether this feeling means anything at all, or whether it's simply anxiety, overthinking, imagination running ahead of the facts. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it honestly, because this topic touches something considerably more personal than most of what we've covered throughout this series. The sense that exposure of harmful behavior sometimes arrives with a quality that feels less like coincidence and more like unfolding, purposeful revelation. We're going to walk through 5 specific signs many people describe experiencing when this kind of exposure begins, not as proof of anything that can be objectively verified, but as a framework worth understanding for anyone who has sensed this particular quality of unfolding clarity and wondered whether it deserved to be trusted. Let's start with the first sign, because it's often the earliest and the most disorienting precisely because it arrives before any external evidence has actually surfaced, an inexplicable loss of the usual justifications you'd relied on to explain away difficult behavior. This is worth understanding precisely because for most people who've spent considerable time in a relationship with a narcissist, an entire internal library of explanations has been built up over months or years. They're just stressed. They had a difficult childhood. I'm probably misreading this. Everyone has bad days. These explanations, however inaccurate, have likely served an important function, allowing you to remain in the relationship without confronting the full weight of what was actually happening. Here's what many people describe experiencing right before genuine exposure begins. These explanations simply stop working, seemingly overnight, without any new evidence arriving to specifically disprove them. The same behavior that used to be explainable through one of these familiar justifications suddenly feels, instead, exactly like what it actually is, without the protective distortion that made it tolerable before. This shift is worth understanding as genuinely significant, regardless of how you understand its ultimate source, because it represents a kind of clarity that typically requires either considerable external evidence or considerable internal readiness in order to arrive, and when it arrives seemingly on its own, without either of these usual catalysts clearly present, many people describe experiencing this as something considerably larger than ordinary psychological insight, a sense that something outside their own effort was actually responsible for finally removing the fog. Let's talk about the second sign, one that often follows shortly after the first. An unexpected convergence of information arriving from multiple, unrelated sources, all pointing toward the same underlying truth, within a surprisingly compressed window of time. This is worth understanding specifically, because it's different from simply gathering more evidence over an extended period through your own deliberate investigation. What many people describe as something considerably more striking, a friend mentioning an observation they'd never shared before, a memory suddenly resurfacing with new clarity, an unrelated conversation that happens to illuminate something specific about the pattern you've been living inside, all arriving within days or weeks of each other. Rather than being spread out across the kind of extended, gradual timeline more ordinary self-discovery typically follows. This convergence, when it happens, is worth naming as one of the most commonly reported experiences among people who describe feeling that their exposure to a narcissist's true patterns was somehow orchestrated, rather than simply stumbled upon through their own effort alone. It's worth holding this observation honestly, rather than either dismissing it as pure coincidence or treating it as unquestionable proof of anything specific. What's worth acknowledging is simply this: many people report this exact pattern, multiple sources of clarity arriving within a compressed, unlikely time frame. And this pattern deserves to be named and examined rather than left unexplored simply because it resists easy, purely rational explanation. Let's talk about the third sign, one that connects to something we've traced throughout other explorations in this series, but takes on a different quality specifically in this context: the sudden, unexpected arrival of people into your life who seem specifically equipped to help you see clearly, precisely at the moment you need that clarity most. This might look like a new friendship that develops with someone who happens to have direct, relevant experience with exactly this kind of relationship dynamic. It might look like a therapist, chosen for reasons that seemed unrelated at the time, who turns out to have exactly the expertise needed to help you understand what's actually happening. It might look like a family member who suddenly, unexpectedly shares an observation they'd been holding back for years, arriving at precisely the moment you're finally ready to actually hear it. This is worth understanding as considerably more than simple good fortune, at least according to how many people describe experiencing it. There's often a quality to this specific pattern that feels distinctly different from ordinary social happenstance, a sense that these particular people, arriving at this particular time, were somehow specifically positioned to help you see what you needed to see, precisely when you needed to see it. This is worth holding as a genuine, worthwhile observation rather than something to explain away purely through statistical likelihood. Because the specific timing and specific relevance so many people describe experiencing deserves real, honest consideration rather than automatic dismissal. What we haven't yet explored are the remaining two signs, each one revealing a different dimension of how this process of exposure often tends to unfold. And understanding all five together, along with what this entire pattern might actually mean for how you interpret and respond to the clarity you're currently experiencing, let's move into the fourth sign. It's one that many people describe as among the most disorienting, precisely because it involves something considerably harder to prepare for than clarity arriving from outside sources, the exposure beginning to include your own hidden patterns, not just theirs. This is worth understanding carefully because it represents a shift many people don't anticipate when they first start experiencing the earlier signs we discussed in Part 1. It's relatively easy, even comforting in its own way, to have someone else's harmful patterns finally, clearly revealed. It's considerably more uncomfortable when that same wave of clarity begins turning inward, illuminating your own contributions to the dynamic. Your own fear of conflict, your own tendency to minimize red flags, your own difficulty trusting your instincts, patterns that existed long before this particular relationship ever began. Here's what's worth understanding about why this particular sign, uncomfortable as it is, often gets described as one of the most meaningful rather than one of the most discouraging. If genuine spiritual growth is actually occurring, exposure rarely stays neatly confined to only revealing someone else's flaws while leaving your own entirely untouched. This kind of one-sided revelation is one that conveniently exposes only the other person while leaving you feeling entirely without responsibility or growth of your own. Tends to be considerably rarer and considerably less transformative than exposure that includes honest examination of both sides of the dynamic. Many people describe this specific sign as evidence that something genuinely purposeful is occurring, precisely because it isn't simply validating their anger or their victimhood, but is instead offering something considerably more complete, an invitation toward genuine self-understanding alongside understanding of the harmful relationship itself. This is worth understanding as distinctly different from self-blame. And it's worth naming this distinction clearly. It's because it matters enormously for how you interpret this specific sign if you're currently experiencing it. Self-blame says the harm was your fault, that you deserved what happened, that your own flaws somehow justify or explain away someone else's harmful choices. This isn't what's being described here. What's actually being described is something considerably more constructive, an honest examination of the patterns that made you vulnerable to this particular dynamic in the first place. Patterns worth understanding not because they excuse anyone's harmful behavior, but because understanding them genuinely protects you from walking into a similar dynamic again in the future, with someone else under different circumstances, but following the exact same underlying patterns. Let's talk about the fifth and final sign, one that ties together everything we've discussed across this exploration into its most significant, and often most difficult to accept form: a growing, unmistakable sense that staying silent or continuing to protect this person's image is no longer something you're able to do, even when doing so would genuinely be easier, and considerably less costly than speaking or acting on what you now clearly understand. This is worth understanding as considerably different from simply deciding, through deliberate reasoning, that speaking up or setting boundaries is the correct choice. What many people describe instead is something closer to an internal impossibility, a genuine inability to continue the old pattern of protection and silence, even when every practical consideration would suggest that continuing to stay quiet remains the easier, safer path. This is worth understanding as significant precisely because it often arrives despite genuine, practical reasons to remain silent. Financial entanglement, shared children, social circles that would be disrupted, reputation concerns, fear of consequences. Many people describe experiencing this fifth sign specifically as the sense that these entirely legitimate, entirely rational concerns simply no longer hold the same weight they once did, that some part of them has become genuinely unwilling to continue the exact silence and protection that once felt not just easier, but necessary for survival within the relationship itself. Let's bring these five signs together now, because understanding what they share underneath their different individual expressions matters considerably for how you interpret whatever you're currently experiencing. the disappearance of familiar justifications, the unexpected convergence of information from multiple sources, the arrival of specifically relevant people at precisely the right time, the extension of exposure into your own patterns rather than only theirs, and the growing inability to maintain silence despite genuine practical reasons to do so. All five of these share a quality many people describe as feeling considerably larger and considerably more coherent than random coincidence typically feels, a sense of purposeful unfolding rather than simple, disconnected happenstance. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what this entire pattern actually means for how you should respond going forward, and why understanding these signs as meaningful shouldn't become a reason to wait passively for further revelation, but should instead become an invitation to actively participate in the clarity and courage this process seems to be making available to you. Let's talk about how to actually respond to these 5 signs, because recognizing them clearly is only useful if it translates into something practical, and this is genuinely important to address directly before closing this exploration. There's a real risk worth naming honestly. Interpreting these signs as meaningful can sometimes lead people toward a kind of passive waiting. The assumption that if this clarity is truly being provided for a purpose, the appropriate response is simply to wait for even more revelation, more confirmation, more undeniable proof, before actually acting on what's already become clear. This is worth addressing directly, because it inverts something important about how purposeful unfolding actually seems to work, based on what so many people describe experiencing. The clarity that arrives through these 5 signs isn't typically meant to replace your own responsibility to act. It's meant to remove the excuses that were previously preventing you from acting, the confusion, the self-doubt, the lack of outside perspective, the fear that you were somehow imagining or exaggerating what was actually happening. Once these obstacles have genuinely been removed, through whichever combination of these 5 signs you've personally experienced, the responsibility to actually respond, to set boundaries, to speak honestly, to make necessary changes in your own life, remains genuinely yours to carry forward. The exposure was never meant to do this final work for you. Let's talk about what active participation in this process actually looks like, because it's worth making concrete rather than leaving it abstract. If you've experienced the disappearance of familiar justifications, the appropriate response isn't to search for new justifications to replace the old ones, hoping to restore the comfortable fog that's been lifted. It's to sit honestly with what remains once those justifications are gone, allowing yourself to actually see the pattern clearly, even though this clarity is considerably more uncomfortable than the fog ever was. If you've experienced convergent information arriving from multiple sources, the appropriate response isn't to dismiss any single piece of it as insufficient on its own, waiting for one final, perfectly conclusive piece of evidence that may never actually arrive. It's to honestly weigh the accumulated weight of everything that's already surfaced, trusting that convergence itself, rather than any single decisive piece of proof, is often exactly the form clarity actually takes. If you've experienced the arrival of specifically helpful people at precisely the right time, the appropriate response isn't to passively wait for them to solve the situation on your behalf. It's to actually receive what they're offering, their perspective, their support, their relevant experience, and to let that reception genuinely inform your own next steps, rather than treating their arrival as simply interesting, without allowing it to actually change anything about your own behavior going forward. If you've experienced exposure extending into your own patterns, the appropriate response isn't self-punishment or excessive guilt, but genuine, patient work toward understanding why you were vulnerable to this particular dynamic, work that protects your future rather than simply condemning your past. And if you've experienced a growing inability to maintain silence despite genuine practical costs to speaking, the appropriate response is trusting that this inability is itself meaningful information, worth honoring rather than continuing to override through sheer willpower alone. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. One that connects this specific topic to something considerably larger this entire series has explored from many different angles throughout its full length. If you've experienced these 5 signs, or even some meaningful combination of them, the appropriate response was never simply to feel comforted by the sense that something larger is unfolding, though that comfort, when it's genuinely present, is worth honoring rather than dismissing. The appropriate response is to understand this unfolding as an invitation, one that asks something real of you in return, courage to act on clarity once it's genuinely arrived, willingness to release relationships and patterns that this clarity has revealed as genuinely harmful, an honest commitment to becoming through whatever combination of grace and effort actually applies to your own understanding, someone considerably less vulnerable to this exact pattern repeating itself in the future. So if you've been experiencing this particular quality of unfolding clarity, this sense that something larger than your own effort alone seems to be revealing what needed revealing, precisely when you needed it revealed, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series. Whatever framework you use to understand where this clarity originates, since its actual value was never to remain purely comforting or purely explanatory. It was meant to be acted upon courageously and honestly, as becoming the foundation for genuine change rather than simply a source of reassurance that made the difficult work of actually changing feel slightly less lonely to finally, fully begin.